So the Apple Podcasts app is huge. It is the biggest podcast player in the world. Spotify is about to catch it and overtake it, but Spotify is doing that on basically every platform in the world, where Apple's podcast app only really exists on Apple's platforms. That's really impressive, and I wanted to see what's the deal with this app. I have never really used it. I used it years ago, didn't like it. I wanted to see if anything's changed, if it's better than it used to be, if I've changed since last time. I just wanted to see what the app was like. And so I've been using it for the past 2 weeks as my only podcast player. I've got some thoughts on it, but I also wanted to talk to people who use the app already and choose it intentionally over the other apps that are out there. I wanted to see what do they like about it, what makes them be drawn to this app, why do so many people seem drawn to it? And so I think I got some answers for both other people and me. I wanted to share them today. So over the past few weeks, I've been talking to people who use the podcast app all the time. So these are people both on Twitter who are more technical, more nerdy, like me, probably like you, and then also people in my normal life who aren't as nerdy, aren't as technical, aren't going to be watching videos like this, where we go into the intricacies of podcast apps, just to get an idea for what people like. So I've come up with a list of 7 things that I see as pretty universal reasons people use the Apple Podcasts app. There's a whole bunch of other reasons, but these are kind of the ones that I heard over and over again. And so by far the biggest thing that came up was it's a default app. It's just there when I buy an iPhone, and I can enter my podcasts into the Podcasts app and it plays them, and that's great. I don't have to find which podcast app is best. I don't need to figure any of that out. And just from a practicality perspective, it's pretty reliable to think that Apple is going to continue to maintain this app, that it's going to remain pretty high quality. It's just a safe bet and it's already there. So defaults are super powerful in software all the time, and this is an example of it. The second thing that kept coming up, and this is definitely related to the first point, is that the app is free. People just prefer a free app over a paid one, and I totally get that. I'm happy to pay a developer $10 a year to use a podcast app that is finely tuned to work for people like me, but most people aren't. They'd rather use a free option, especially if that free option is good enough. They'll just go with it, and that's what they're doing with the podcast app. Which brings us nicely into point number 3, which is the app is good enough. It's not necessarily perfect for everybody. Some people had nothing bad to say about it. Other people did have complaints, but in general, they said they were still using the app because, frankly, it's good enough. And the fact that it's pre-installed, it's always going to be there, it's free, it means that the little things that they don't like about it or don't work quite how they want, they're happy to work around them because they're getting something that's, again, always there and totally free. They'd rather do that than pay extra money to get something that might work a little differently, might work a little better even, but it's just good enough, and that's fine. And that's how it is for most apps. Every default app on the iPhone is pretty darn good, and it's going to satisfy the needs for most people. But there's always a market for people building more elaborate, more opinionated apps that some people will want to pay for because they either want or need more than the stock app provides. And that's great. But this is also why a lot of people are going to say the podcast app is totally fine for them. It's not extraordinary necessarily, but it gets the job done, and that's all they need. Number 4 is that it works better with Siri than the other apps. So I can just say, play the latest episode of The Daily, and it'll play the latest episode of The Daily on my iPhone in the podcast app. And if I was already listening to it, it'll pick up where I left off. Works really nicely. Similarly, point number 5 is that it also works with the HomePod. So I can ask my HomePod to play today's episode of The Daily, and it'll play it. And again, we'll pick up where I left off. We'll sync my progress through the episode across my devices. Great. Love it. So those 2 things are definitely things that third-party apps don't do. A lot of it is because they can't do it as well. We're kind of getting into the territory of, do Apple apps do these things better because Apple made them better, or are they doing it better because Apple doesn't allow third parties to do those things? We don't necessarily need to get into that into this video, but definitely a thing to think about. But those are things that numerous people brought up: Siri working better and HomePods working better with the native podcast app. Number 6 is really similar to those 2, actually. There's kind of a theme in this stretch. Apple Watch works better with the official podcast app as well. Syncing is more reliable. Episodes seem to be there when you expect them to. It just works better than third-party apps. Even in my case, where I love the Apple Watch and I love third-party apps, I don't really mess around with the watch sync stuff because it just seems to be either super slow or unreliable. It's just not great. And again, I don't know if this is a case of the third-party developers could do better and they're not, or they're simply not able to do it. So who knows, but this is definitely a point in favor of the podcast app. If you have an Apple Watch, the odds of it being able to reliably sync episodes over to your watch so you can listen while you're away from your phone is better. And number 7 is the fact that the podcast app syncs across your devices and syncs quickly and reliably, unlike other apps that some people had experiences with. Now, this is actually the most inconsistent one. I had a few people say the exact opposite. They said, I like the podcast app, but it's terrible at syncing across devices. Your mileage may vary here. I've actually heard people say that like third-party apps like Overcast and Castro sync great. Other people say they sync terribly, and that's why they use the official app. So this is all over the board. Syncing is a tricky thing, and it doesn't seem to be exactly the same for everybody, but this is a thing that numerous people brought up as well, is that they can just trust when they add a show on their iPhone, it'll show up on their Mac. When they play it on their iPad, that progress will show up on their iPhone. Everything just works together pretty well. So those are the 7 things that a lot of people brought up with why they use the podcast app. So that's what everyone else thought, but what about me? I've been using it for 2 weeks after years of not using it. What did I think? So I had 3 things that I did like about the app. So the first thing is design. The app really reminds me of Apple Music, which I also use and also enjoy. So I think the app just looks good. I think a lot of the organization is solid and gets me to what I want to listen to relatively quick. There is one caveat there that I'll get into in a second. But in general, the app is just a joy to use. There's good animations. I like the use of colorful shadows under like album art or podcast art, I suppose. It's a fun app to navigate, and I like having it on screen. I just like interacting with it, which is definitely points in its favor. I also think discovery is great in this app. It's really good at showing me new shows that I might be interested in, whether they're just general interest shows that are kind of on the front page of the browse section, or when it's suggesting new shows to me on the Listen Now page. It does a really good job of finding things that I would be interested in, again, whether they're tailored to me or they're just general interest things. It does a really great job of this. And of course, this is because Apple has tons of resources to throw at this. The people who are doing this at Apple to just kind of curate content is surely much larger than the entire teams who are building a lot of these third-party apps. So that's definitely why that's happening, but it's a benefit to me, the end user, so I appreciate it. And finally, this might be me stretching a little bit, but I really like how the sleep timer works. I can set it to a bunch of different times. I can set it to the end of this episode or the end of this chapter that I'm currently in. So I like all of that. I also like that it fades out the audio when you get to the end of your sleep timer. So that's kind of nice. It doesn't just cut it off like some other apps do. So it's a nice little thing. I use sleep timers actually quite a bit, and so I like how this one works. That's the best I can say about it. But it's definitely not all rosy, and there are things that annoy me about this app. And I don't like to be too negative in these videos, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So the first thing that annoys me is I like to see a list of podcasts that I've subscribed to. I want to see the most recent episodes, and I want to be able to play them quickly. And the podcast app doesn't necessarily do this as easily as I'd like. So the page that I really want to see is under Library, Latest Episodes. So I have to basically, when I launch the app, I have to tap on Library in the main menu, and then I have to go up to the top of the page and tap on Latest Episodes. And that's just 2 taps to get to the screen that I'd like to just go to all the time. There's no way for me to set it to always go there. The Listen Now page is not always going to recommend the thing that I want to listen to. I like more control, and so that's the page I want to go to. It's a few taps away. It's definitely annoying. I'm also not a fan of how show notes and chapters work in the app. Show notes are actually okay, but they live underneath the now playing screen. You have to scroll down to see them. You can't tap on time codes or anything. You can tap on links, which is nice, but you can't tap on time codes to go to those spots in the episode. I made a whole other video about how I like that feature. And then chapters are really the thing that bother me the most, is they're even below the notes. So you often have to scroll way down to get to them in the first place. And then once you're there, they show you when the chapters start, but you don't know when they end specifically. You can kind of figure it out based on the other chapters, but like you don't know where you are in the episode. You don't know how far you are through each chapter. It's just annoying, in my opinion, just accessing chapters through this. And I know chapters are still kind of a niche thing. Most mainstream shows don't use them anymore. But if the app is going to do chapters, I feel like they should do them better than they're doing them here. And then I was surprised I had to manually enter all of my podcasts to get them into the app. There was no way for me to export an OMPL file from Overcast and then import that into the podcast app on my iPhone or iPad. Maybe it's available on the Mac, but I was doing this all for my mobile devices, and every other app lets me do that. I can export into that format, and then I can import from another app. And so that makes it super easy for me to go from Overcast to Castro in like 30 seconds, whereas in Apple Podcasts, I had to manually enter the 20 shows or so that I follow. It's more work than I wanted. It's, I guess, a one and done thing, but still kind of annoying. And then this one really surprised me. I was walking the dog, I was listening to an episode in the podcast app, had my AirPods in, and I wanted to skip like 30 seconds to skip over the ad break. And so I just like squeezed my AirPod twice, expecting that to skip forward 30 seconds because that's what happens in the UI. The UI, as far as I can tell, doesn't have a button at all to skip to the end of the episode. And to my surprise, it skipped to the end of the episode. So doing this on my AirPod, skip to the end of the episode, or this, or whatever sort of AirPod you have, I wasn't expecting that. So that was kind of weird. Then later, I did it in the car through CarPlay, and when I hit on my steering wheel, I've got a little paddle to go forward, and in Overcast, it skips forward 30 seconds, in Castro, it skips forward 30 seconds, in Pocket Cast, it skips forward 30 seconds, in Google Podcasts, Stitcher, every other app, Spotify, it skips forward 30 seconds. In Apple Podcasts, it skips forward to the end of the episode. I have no idea why this happens. It's kind of crazy to me, but this is what they've decided makes sense, and it makes no sense at all to me. So if I'm listening to a podcast and I want to skip over something, I have to actually take the phone out of my pocket. I have to unlock my phone. I have to make sure the podcast app is open, get to the now playing screen, and then hit the button to skip forward 30 seconds. That's wild to me. And then the last two things. One is that episodes just show up late. There are sometimes hours behind the other apps, which isn't always a problem, but it is a problem for episodes that are released specifically to hit you before you go on a commute. So a lot of these morning shows are in the morning, and sometimes I don't get them until like 9 a.m. after I've already done my morning commute. I'm not commuting quite as much these days, but I go on walks or I do drive somewhere in the morning, and the podcast isn't always there like it always was in my other apps. So that's annoying as well. And then finally, this feels kind of like a bug, but it's just what it's been for me, is when I AirPlay to a HomePod, I lose the ability to play back at anything other than 1x speed. So I tend to listen to my podcast at 1.5x. We don't need to talk about that. It works for me. But I am not able to do 1.5x on my HomePods. I can do it on AirPods. I can do it when I plug in to another device. That all works great, works in CarPlay, but when I AirPlay to HomePods, I lose that ability. And then I annoyingly, when I stop AirPlaying to the HomePod and start putting it back on my iPhone is now set to 1x speed, so I have to set it back to 1.5x. It's just annoying. So I definitely have some issues with the Podcasts app. It's not perfect by any means for my use case. And again, I'm doing this as an individual user thinking selfishly about what I want from a podcast app. I'm not doing this as a product manager who's trying to figure out what the best mainstream options are to hit the biggest chunk of the market. That's not what I'm doing. I'm looking at, as a user, what do I like about podcast apps? What do I need from them? And this is what I think about the podcast app from Apple. It's actually better than I expected, though. So I know I just listed off a bunch of things that I don't like, but it's better than I expected, and I actually kind of like it. I'm not actually dying to get back to my previous apps. The previous apps are better. Again, I'd rather use Overcast, I'd rather use Castro, I'd rather use Pocket Casts, but I don't hate this. And so I actually think I have a better appreciation for why people use this app. And I don't know, I will sympathize more with people saying, oh, I use the Apple Podcast app, instead of me reacting like, why? Do you know that these other apps exist? Your life could be so much better. I actually have more perspective now, I think, on how the app works, and I'm happy I have it. Hopefully this has given you some inspiration to maybe try out the podcast app again if you haven't for a long time. See if it works for you at all. Definitely not perfect, but it might be better than you remember. So if you enjoyed the video, I hope you give it a thumbs up below. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you here next time. Bye-bye.